So good afternoon, everyone. We warmly welcome you all, each and every one of you, to the closing ceremony, closing activity of the Philippine Pavilion's Tripa de Gallina, Gods of Estuary. But before we begin, I ask everyone to stand up for the Philippine National Anthem.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas. Kayang mag-ibig, kelas ng sinakalan, alam ng puso, sa dikit mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, tuyag ka ng magiting, sa manlulupin, di ka pasisigil, sa gagatak tutok sa simoy at sa langit ng pagaw, ay hinatang tulad, awit sa pagkayang minamahal. Ang matawag mo'y tagumpay na nag-iindig, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pang ay di magdidinig. Luman ang araw ng buwan, ating pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Ang ligaya ng pantay mga api, at mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Wow, ang dami na natin. So magandang hapon po muli. Buti na lang marami-rami ang ating silya. Today, we are closing the Philippine Pavilion differently from the way we close our previous editions. This time, it is through a roundtable discussion titled The Estuary in Southeast Asia, Reflections on Ecological and Social History, a program designed by PAVB advisor Dr. Patrick Flores. Before we proceed, we recognize the presence of the heads and members of different Filipino communities in the following areas. May I request the representatives to stand up? From Bologna, meron ba? Coming pa ang Bologna. Corneliano. Palakpakan naman natin ang Corneliano. Yan. Ferrara. I think Ferrara bago, no? Padova. Siyempre. Treviso. Trieste. Terraferma. Vicenza. Venezia. And Mestre. Palakpakan natin ating mga sarili. So, taon-taon para tayo nagre-reunion. Pero this time, medyo seryoso ang ating discussion. This afternoon, the discussion will be a bit serious. We especially acknowledge the officials of the OFW Watch led by Mr. J. Retuta, National Chairman, OFW Watch Youth. Nandito na ba sila, Kuya Non? Parating pala. Traffic na. We are honored and by the presence of Honorable Ambassador again, Nathaniel G. Imperial, Philippine Embassy, Rome. Sir, thank you for coming. Commissioner Arvin Manuel R. Villalon of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. Arvin, tumayo ka naman. Sam Domingo, are you here? Okay. Attorney Georgia De Biasi, magandang hapon. Honorary Consul in Venice. At saka syempre ang members of the press who are here from the Philippine Daily Inquirer, Alia Honasan. Ang ating suki from Philippine Star, Igan Dibayan and A.V. Tan. Before po we proceed, may request those sitting near the camera, so please do not obstruct the camera. Okay, do not stand immediately in front of the camera. Okay, so more importantly, we sincerely appreciate the presence of President Chikuto. I think he's coming now, of La Biennale de Venezia. This afternoon, while we celebrate the Philippine Pavilion's Tripa de Gallina, Gods of Estuary, we are opening opportunities for the continued and sustained discussion on the current state of our waterways. This time, not only in the Philippines, but we expand the discussion to Southeast Asia. So hindi na lang Pilipinas. Subalit bago po ako magpatuloy, pakinggan po muna natin si kagalang-galang Nathaniel G. Imperial para sa kanyang mensahe. Ambassador?
Maraming salamat. Commissioner Arvin Villalon, Dr. Michael Pante, Mr. Anthony Medrano, of course my good friend Dr. Patrick Flores, Curator Sam Domingo and Architect Choi Funk, Consul Georgia Di Biasi, members of the Philippine delegation, and mga kababayan, dear guests, buenas era. I had the great privilege of being here for the opening of the Philippine Pavilion in May, having just arrived in Rome as Philippine Ambassador to Italy. I am back 6 months later with a strong sense of pride for the great success of the Philippine Pavilion and the hard work of the women and men behind this exhibition, which we will close today. As a former resident of the Malate district, I am aware of the social context as well as the atrocious aroma of the Tripa de Gallina, the estuary that snakes through the poverty-stricken neighborhoods of Old Manila, where Manila's elites used to reside before World War II laid waste to most of the city. Since then, the neighborhood has mutated into a mixed sprawl of urban poor dwellings, buildings, and commercial establishments. Indeed, it has become a community that managed to persist, even if barely, within the stifling megalopolis that Manila has mutated into. The guts of estuary metaphor is therefore an apt image of the violence with which the city and its planners have mistreated or neglected what once was an idyllic part of Extramuros, contradicting the cleansing, life-giving, and life-affirming purpose of an estuary. Having lived near the Tripa, I can say that it is not an Instagrammable sight to behold, and yet a community lives and thrives along its banks, families whose lives and future can benefit immensely from the intervention of people with far-reaching ideas that offer the promise of hope. I congratulate the curators and the architects for their bold exhibition. The bamboo structure behind you is both architectural design and installation art. It investigates the intersection of urban planning and design, water pollution and environmental sustainability, local governance, and community empowerment. It inspires the communities along the estuary to be part of the effort to make their living spaces cleaner, safer, and more livable. I hope that Barangay Malate and the Manila City Hall will, in the future, support the installation of these bamboo bridges so that this architectural design can be fully realized as a constructive solution to real issues affecting the Tripa de Gallina communities and locality. I wish to thank the NCCA and the Office of Senator Loren Legarda for their invaluable contribution to the Philippine Pavilion this year. I also would like to thank the Filipino community in Northern Italy for their spirit of volunteerism and for being our cultural envoys in Italy. I will certainly recommend that the Philippine government continue its support for the Philippine participation in the Biennale, which continues to be an important platform to show the world the creative talent of Filipino artists and the progressive ideas of our architects. Buenas era.
Thank you, Ambassador Imperial. The Philippine participation at the Venice Art and Architecture Biennale since 2015 has remained a collaborative undertaking of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, the Department of Foreign Affairs, and the Office of Senate President Pro Tempore Loren Legarda, our project principal and visionary. As a national agency on arts and culture, the NCCA leads the implementation and works directly with La Biennale. Ladies and gentlemen, we call on Commissioner Arvin Manuel R. Villalon, representative of NCCA Chair Ina Manalo. Sir Arvin.
Thank you, Ms. Ria, Honorable Nathaniel Imperial, and of course all the members and colleagues from Philippine Embassy in Milan. our distinguished resource speakers, members of the Filipino community in Italy, our friends from the media, dear guests, good afternoon. May hapon sa inyong tanan na imbag na malam. It's good to be here and with, of course, the Filipinos. Through the featured exhibition of this year's International Architecture Exhibition of La Biennale de Venezia, Tripa de Gallina, or Gods of Estuary, we have embarked on a journey through the realms of history, culture, ecology, technology, and architecture. Today, we gather to reflect on the profound insights we have gained and the critical discussion we have engaged in. The Philippine Pavilion at this year's Venice Biennale has been a beacon of inspiration and intellectual exploration, bringing together architects, designers, scholars, visionaries, and enthusiasts of culture and heritage. One of the highlights of our participation in this year's Biennale is this insightful roundtable session happening today. The discussion is not merely a gathering of minds, but a vibrant platform for profound reflections on the ecological and social history of estuaries in Southeast Asia. It serves as a significant milestone in our commitment to understanding and preserving the cultural and ecological heritage of our region. Through meaningful conversations and shared perspectives, we will navigate the complexities of the past, present, and future of estuaries, acknowledging the vital role they play in our societies. The roots of this session extend to the very heart of Tripa de Gallina, or Gods of Estuary, constructing a narrative around the historical significance of these waterways, seeking to envision a future that transcends the pressing environmental challenges it faces in the present. The narratives of communities, the strong stories of resilience, and the architectural responses to the environmental dynamics are woven into the fabric of the discussion this afternoon. We look forward to examining the intricate relationship between people and the environment and how it shapes not only their lives, but also the collective memory and identity of a community. Delving into the complexities and nuances of estuaries and esteros in Southeast Asia, we look into how these unique bodies of water have played a central role in the development of our societies, witnessing the ups and downs of history with their stories intertwined with our own. As we conclude this year's participation at the Venice Biennale, let us carry this knowledge that our work is far from over. The insights gained from our discussions must not remain confined within the walls of this pavilion. They should serve as a catalyst for action, prompting us to advocate for the preservation of these bodies of water and the cultural heritage they encompass. As stewards of culture and heritage, we must work together to ensure that the waterways continue to thrive and the communities that call them home are nurtured and protected. Our commitment extends beyond this moment and should be a driving force in our collective efforts to safeguard the environment for future generations. Just before I read the last paragraph, let me also have my thoughts about this. Alam natin sa Pilipinas, pag sinabi mong estero, yun nga, sasabi kanina ni Ambassador, mabaho, parang ayaw na natin balikan. Pero itong alaala na nandito tayo sa Venezia, na nakikita natin yung ganda, kaya masasabi natin itong estero ay dalawa, alaala at siya din ay isang palaban na anong magagawa natin bilang Pilipino. So, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to all those who have contributed to the success of this exhibition, who have dedicated their passion and expertise to this endeavor. I also thank our international partners and fellow advocates of culture who have shared in our mission. May we carry the spirit of Tripa de Gallina, or the Gods of Estuary, with us, not only as a memory of this exhibition, but as a reminder of our duty to our environment and our heritage. Together, let us continue to embrace a connection to the past for a sustainable and prosperous future. Mabuhay po ang lahat. Magandang hapon po sa inyo lahat.
Thank you, Commissioner Arvin, our colleague in arts and culture work since since way back. I don't want to mention the year anymore. Yeah, and now we go to the main agenda of the day, the roundtable discussion. To elaborate the theme and introduce our esteemed scholars, I am pleased to give you the moderator of the roundtable discussion, our advisor and notable curator, Dr. Patrick D. Flores.
Thank you, Ria, for the introduction at magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. We convened this roundtable to support the propositions of the Philippine Pavilion for this year's Venice Architecture Biennale. We are doing this by way of a closing event that opens up the pavilion to further discourse and also to an afterlife of thinking and taking action. It is important to note that the necessary discourse around the pavilion on a particular estuary in Manila called Tripa de Gallina comes from different sources. The one source, of course, is the curatorial effort that is made possible by the curators and architects of the pavilion, the Venice Biennale, and the various entities of the Philippine government. The other source is the response of the people living around the estuary, who are the agents of either the catalysis of change or the cataclysm of indifference and climate. And still another source is a scholarship on the estuarine condition in the Philippines and Southeast Asia. The analysis as well as the potential strategy to craft environmental and heritage policies, cultivate a responsive and responsible public sphere, and foreground the estuary as a vital node in the network of bodies of natural formations, human beings, spirits, but also the range of mediations from infrastructure to folklore, from local government to globalization, from the migration of inhabitants to the migration of species. With this as context, the pavilion becomes part of a more extensive historical and ecological sequence. And in the contact zone of the estuary, the Biennale and the interdisciplinary reflection, the previous binaries of nature and culture, local and global, architecture and society no longer become too attractive or inevitable, predictable, or even preemptive. We're fortunate this afternoon to listen to two of the leading social scientists and historians on the estuarine material, both first-timers in Venice, who will walk us through the ecological, cultural, political, and social history of the estuary in the Philippines and Southeast Asia, and its connections to the world historical picture of Venice, in both the registers of its imperial past and in the contemporary life world of creative forms broadly described as architectural. Through the roundtable, we bring together the three sources of practice around the estuary in the premises of the pavilion itself, in which curators, architects, residents, scholars, development and cultural workers, urban planners, and the Filipino community in Italy generate a lively conversation on the estuary in the long duration of history and ecology, in the urgency of the ethnographic present, and in the imagination of a possible future. It is from this matrix of relations that the pavilion emerges, mainly through its argument and ethos of the bamboo structure as the nexus between water and dwelling, or as a place of a sustainable convergence, or as a forum of misgivings and aspirations. In many ways, this bamboo metaphor performs the trope of the estuary as an intersectional opportunity, both a parable and a modified parabola, as evoked by its form. At this point, I would like to introduce the speakers. First is Michael Di Pante. He's an associate professor at the Department of History at Ateneo de Manila University and the chief editor of Philippine Studies, Historical and Ethnographic Viewpoints. He's the author of A Capital City at the Margins, Quezon City and Urbanization in the 20th Century, Philippines, published by the Ateneo and the Kyoto University Press, And the title of his presentation this afternoon is From Venice to the East, From Venice of the East to the Warsaw of Asia, the Meanders of Manila's Esteros in Philippine History. Second speaker is Anthony D. Medrano, is the National University of Singapore Presidential Young Professor of Environmental Studies at Yale and US College. He also holds appointments in the Department of History at NUS, the Asia Research Institute, and the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum. His work was appeared in publications such as the Journal of Asian Studies, Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, Forest and Society, and Philippine Studies Historical and Ethnographic Viewpoints. He is completing his first book, and we are looking forward to that, Anthony, The Edible Ocean, Science, Industry, and the Rise of Urban Southeast Asia for Yale University Press. The title of his presentation is Creole Waters, Stories of Life and Loss in Southeast Asia's Estuaries. So please help me welcome Mike and Anthony. So we begin with Mike's presentation.
Salamat, Patrick. At, well, of course, salamat sa invitasyon ni Patrick and the rest of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. Thank you for inviting me. As mentioned by Patrick, this is my first time and such a wonderful time. Since the day I arrived, palagi ko nakalabas yung cellphone ko kasi kailangan ko mag-picture. So, very nice city. Venice, of course, is in the imagination of many. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said about Manila. But centuries ago, people were, in fact, comparing Venice to Manila. And that's the jump-off point of my presentation this afternoon. That's why I titled my presentation From Venice of the East to the Warsaw of Asia, the Meanders of Manila's Esteros in Philippine History. And I think it's a good sign that the curators, the artists behind the Philippine exhibit chose Tripa de Gallina as the focal point of this year's exhibition, mainly because of how the image of chicken tripe, chicken innards, that is the literal translation of Tripa de Gallina, can be imagined as a kind of reverse fortune telling. Probably for some of us, we're aware of this practice of aruspicy. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but in many cultures, there are traditions of using the innards of animals as a kind of fortune telling practice. But for this presentation, it'll be reversed. Okay, rather than fortune telling, okay, I'll be using the metaphor of the chicken innards, the guts, as a kind of looking back, peering back into our future. Our Tripa de Gallina, not quite a black mirror, but more of a brackish mirror that gives us an image of what was happening in the past. Okay? What was Manila like centuries ago, and is there a way for us to recover that past? And so we begin our journey with the next slide, please. Thank you. I want to begin with this article that I found published in the Journal of the American Chamber of Commerce. Now, the publication is quite notable, mainly because the American Chamber of Commerce Journal essentially served as the mouthpiece of the Manila American business elite during the American colonial period. For those who are not familiar, the Americans colonized the country from 1898 to 1946, of course, with the war serving as an interregnum there. And the American Chamber of Commerce was a very influential group of businessmen, merchants who were based in the Philippines. So more or less, what appears on the pages of this journal are a reflection of their appreciation or lack of their colony. And it really caught my attention that this woman, author named Beryl Hughes, looked at Manila's gondolas and gondoliers and essentially compared Manila to Venice, calling it the Venice of the East. And during that time, travel authors, especially in the colonized East, often use travel writing as a way to distance themselves, distance the colonizers from the colonized, present the colonized as unmodern, traditional in their ways, and therefore they deserve to be colonized. And this article here goes against the grain. It's one of those few exceptions to the rule. And mainly because I think you can already see more or less the content of her writing, trying to see the comparisons between the progressive West and the colonized East. So next slide. And I want to show some of the some of the excerpts from this article. If this is Venice, I wonder where a man can park his car. And of course, here in Venice, there's really no way for you to park your car because cars are not allowed. But I think it's quite notable that Beryl used that as a jump-off point for her article, given that she talks about how automobility in the 1930s, we're talking about the 1930s here, in 1931, so the date of publication, automobiles have already made their way to Manila, and they were consumed, but mainly by the elite, whether natives or Americans. And so moving around for people still relied on non-motorized forms of transportation. A huge segment of the population still relied on human-powered vehicles such as the bangkas, or what she referred to as the gondolas. So she used the word gondolas as a way to refer to bangkas. So for us Filipinos, we simply call them bangka. But for very use, these were veritable gondolas. And for 2 centavos, a busy man can take a ride in one of Manila's tiny ferry boats, made modern and romantic by such names as Showboat or Whoopee. Imagine having gondolas with those names. But that is the kind of everyday mobility for those people. 1930s, yeah, there were already Ford models, General Motors models plying the streets of Manila. But for the common tao, it was either the streetcar of Meralco or the gondolas, mainly because of the omnipresence of Esteros throughout the city of Manila, with these estuaries having an extensive reach throughout the city, from the mouth of the river to the inland parts. It was very, very convenient, very efficient for ordinary people to rely on these waterways for their everyday mobility. Next slide, please. And so, as forms of everyday mobility, Manila was defined by these estuaries. I think it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that even before colonial times, the reason why Manila became one of the most notable barangays, one of the biggest barangays in the pre-colonial society, was because of the presence of all these estuaries. It allowed the mouth of the Pasig River, so this is the mouth, Pasig River, as it flows into the Manila Bay. Sulaiman's pre-colonial settlement was here initially, but because there were estuaries that reach as far north to parts of Caloocan, Malabon, that allowed continuous and predictable economic transactions between rice-growing provinces up north, such as in Bulacan and Pampanga, and the settlement of Sulaiman. And that kind of transaction persisted up until the American colonial period. And when Sulaiman was eventually removed from power because of the arrival of the Spaniards, that system of, as Daniel Deppers would call it, provisionment, okay, providing supplies, day-to-day supplies for the ordinary people, for the general population, that persisted throughout the Spanish colonial period. And if we are to, and here I'm borrowing an idea from a notable historian, Maria Luisa Camagay. According to her, the reason also why Manila's geography was that it was heavily biased towards the northern northern districts of Manila, such as Binondo. Of course, Binondo eventually became the central business district of Spanish colonial Manila. Quiapo was another notable one. Santa Cruz, and certainly Tondo was the heartbeat of the city because it provided the labor. And in sharp contrast, the districts south of Manila, Ermita, Malate, had a more idyllic atmosphere. Certainly today, you wouldn't see that idyllic atmosphere anymore. Okay, because Ermita, Malate are hyper-urbanized as we speak. But during the Spanish colonial times, there was this huge disparity between the economic activities happening up north and down south. And according to Maria Luisa Camagay, a very important factor behind that dichotomy was the presence of more estuaries. The northern districts had a more complex network of canals, esteros that allowed economic activities to flourish. And if you look at Binondo, Binondo is essentially an island outlined by the presence of all these estuaries. So if you look at that it makes Binondo essentially an island. And the warehouses of Binondo as a central business district relied on these waterways so that their warehouses can be supplied and resupplied with products, freight, and of all those products that made Manila's engine moving and moving. Next. And here's a photo of turn of the century Manila with the Esteros as the essential waterways for the city. And this is in fact Intramuros. Okay, so that's Intramuros, and you see here not shanties but houses of the elite. And it's good that the Honorable Ambassador mentioned how the Esteros were preferred sites by the native elite during not just the Spanish colonial period, but also during the American colonial period. Many notable Filipinos, wealthy Filipinos, decided to put up mansions beside the waterways in order for them to maximize not just the economic advantages of being near the waterways, but also the aesthetic capital, that you have a great view, you have a nice breeze, but of course none of that is true anymore. Next slide, please. And just to show you a more close-up photo of the bangka, although this is a rather uncommon bangka given that it has a katig. So the katig is the, how do you call that in English? Rigger, the outrigger. Yes, okay. And then you have polemen, okay? Men with poles in order keeping the bangka moving. Usually bangkas during the American colonial period were without this katig. So most Manileños relied on waterways for their everyday mobility. Next slide. And not just mobility, certainly they also use the esteros for other purposes, such as this one. Taking a bath, okay, taking care of their kids, or showering their kids, doing the laundry, and all that stuff. So you have practically your entire existence. And certainly before the time when Carriedo created the waterworks, which provided tap water to households throughout the city, prior to that innovation, a lot of people also relied on these esteros for sources of everyday water. Next.
Wala.
And of course, even your day-to-day showering for showering purposes, a lot of people went to these esteros in order to take a bath. So that's just it. That goes to show how important these esteros were to everyday Filipinos. Okay, next. But certainly, I think that the most important thing for us to consider is the economic implications of all these esteros. Because these esteros provided the necessary goods that kept the city alive. It sustained the city and provided much needed employment for its residents. Here, it's a canal in Tondo, a district up north, okay, north of the Pasig River. And we also have to take note that because of how significant waterways were during this period, the government even had a huge project. They undertook a huge project of creating a man-made artificial canal at the heart of Binondo, cutting across Tondo, cutting through Tondo and Binondo, and then spilling into the Pasig River. And today we know that artificial canal with the name of Canal de la Reina, named after Queen Isabella of Spain. Canal de la Reina was a man-made artificial canal precisely to do just that. Okay? Become an expressway for freight, for passengers, using all these bangkas. And by the way, using also cascos. Cascos which were roofed. We can also call them a bangka, but they had roofs, and it can accommodate a family. There were even there's even documentation of entire families living inside the cascos, and they were mainly their origin was mainly from the provinces up north, and so they were carriers of merchandise, agricultural goods, coconut, palay, and other agricultural stuff coming from the north being delivered here in Manila. And these families lived inside these cascos as a way of conducting their business here in Tondo. Next. Same thing with Binondo. So the first one was Binondo. The first one was Tondo. And this one was Binondo. Once again, you see here these rows of cascos. And these are the bangkas. Okay? The ones without the cutting. They provided the lifeblood for not just Binondo here, but also to the entire city. Next. Okay. And this one is certainly we have to take note how the Esteros also provided us with nourishment. It's not just a carrier of goods coming from outside the city, but within the Esteros themselves. It had an ecology of edible animals, shellfish, and the like. And so fishermen also took advantage of that. And by the way, take note that this was taken at San Miguel District. And San Miguel District is most notable, of course, for being the district of Malacanang. And so this, once again, goes back to our point of elite families, elite colonial families choosing to establish their residences along these esteros, with the most notable of them being none other than the Governor General himself. The Spanish Governor General initially looked at Malacanang as their summer residence, so they would move from Intramuros to San Miguel every summer to enjoy the summer breeze. But eventually, in 1863, they decided to make it. Yeah, it's hard to imagine today, but that was their intention. Today, it's simply unimaginable. And in 1863, after a huge earthquake, the Governor General, which at that time was Rafael Echague, decided to turn Malacanang into the permanent residence, not just a summer residence, but a permanent residence for the highest colonial official of the land. So that's how important Esteros were for the entire colony. Next. And now we move on to the American colonial period. And so we go back to Beryl Yu's assessment, her article, and what was life like as a result of the American colonial period? Did these everyday mobilities, did they change because of the new colonial regime? If we look at the historical record, it seems like nothing really changed. It seems like more or less the picture I presented to you earlier was more or less the same during the American colonial period. And even with the arrival of new forms of transportation, the electric streetcar of the Meralco, the automobiles of Ford and General Motors, even autobuses. There were already autobus fleets by the 1930s. A huge segment of the population still relied on these waterways. So here's a more close-up look of those so quote-unquote gondoliers. And according to Beryl Hughes, I just want to read this particular excerpt. So Manila's gondoliers are fellows of imagination and resource and believe in keeping up with the time. So even they, and this is quite amazing to hear from a Western author looking at gondoliers, looking at ordinary people as people who modernize themselves. So they believe in keeping up with the times. They must take time a while to go to the movies, for where else they could have found such names for their crafts as have been bestowed on some of them: Showboat, the Volga Boatman, and Whoopee. And the day I saw them, Showboat had just received a new coat of paint and was resplendent with orange tie back curtains in the shelter built across the beam. Had it been a few feet longer with prow and stern built high out of the water, it could have passed for a very credible importation from Venice. So that's the gondoliers for you of American colonial Manila. Next. But with the entry of a new set of rulers, okay, by 1935, the president of the country, although we were not yet independent at that time, with the transition from the American colonial period to the Commonwealth period, with a lot of domestic responsibilities of governance being transferred from the Americans to the Filipinos, with Manuel Quezon, previously Senate President, now acting as the chief executive of the Philippines. Unfortunately, Manuel Quezon would not see in these gondolas, would not see in these esteros and waterways a kind of source of, he wouldn't see it as a resource. He wouldn't see it as an asset that had to be maximized. Rather, people like Manuel Quezon eventually saw it as a liability. And so I want to quote this particular pronouncement coming from Manuel Quezon, that only about 1/3 of the city of Manila has been provided with a proper system of drainage, and the remaining part is dependent upon sea level esteros or canals. And so here we see how for Quezon, esteros had become a source of pollution, a source of mess, and therefore they were quite inadequate, okay, because of poor alignment, insufficient capacity. Next. And what was the solution? Thus making it impossible to maintain sanitary conditions in the districts affected, and it is proposed that these very unsatisfactory conditions be remedied by straightening, widening, and eventually paving those esteros. So now the mindset was that we have to cover them, fill them up, and eventually ensure that rather than have waterways as the main mode of mobility, it would be the cars who were not dependent on these esteros becoming more and more the central focus of everyday transportation. So next. Now, forward to the Japanese colonial period, it's quite interesting that there were some observers, there were some writers who were still trying to fight for the preservation of the esteros. And quite ironically, and this was a piece published in 1943. They were looking at the new colonizers, the Japanese, as a source of inspiration for them to somehow recover the lost glory of the esteros. According to Ivy Malyari, our leaders, like the general run of our people, seem to think of our esteros as a liability rather than an asset, much like Manuel Quezon. So guess what? This was the time when Manuel Quezon had to, go to the United States, escape the wrath of the Japanese. But because of that, there you have a new set of Filipino officials, and Malyari was critical of them. For him, these people were more or less of the same thinking like Manuel Quezon, thinking of the esteros as liabilities rather than assets. So narrow esteros are simply used as sewers, but when they can no longer serve this purpose, they are filled up or covered. Next. And as mentioned, ironically, Malyari looks toward the Japanese as a source of inspiration. Manila residents fail to see the aesthetic possibilities of esteros as employed in other countries like Japan, which occupied the country during the Second World War. And now that the Japanese are here, perhaps they could teach us how to utilize our esteros to advantage. And so following the example of Japan, we could make our esteros the nucleus of a wonderful park system that would be a source of health and joy and pride to all of us. Now, did Malyari's idea come to fruition by the time that we were now independent from the Japanese, from the Americans? Unfortunately, no. Okay, it didn't happen. Because what? Next slide, please. Mainly because of the destruction caused by the Second World War. And I want to point to a memoir written about the Second World War by Joaquin Garcia. It took 4 years for the rising sun to set. And Garcia looks at the case of Tripa de Gallina. And it's interesting, at the same time, very tragic, how Garcia looks at wartime Tripa de Gallina as a long and narrow, dirty waterway, which when at low tide stank to high heavens. As a consequence, it was dubbed Canal Number 5. And as already mentioned, canal in Filipino, it has that connotation of being stinky, smelly. Of course, that was an oblique reference to a brand of perfume. We all know that Manila was the second most destroyed city at the conclusion of the Second World War, and that's the reason why historians, as well as war veterans, constantly refer to Manila as the Warsaw of the East, the Warsaw of Asia. The destruction was so severe that it created an acute shortage in terms of housing. People had nowhere else to go. And to complicate things, people in the provinces were pouring into Manila in search of job opportunities, in search of building materials. And what would this situation lead to? The emergence of a new urban phenomenon, which we now call the barong-barong. And quite unfortunately, the existence of the esteros alongside the barong-barong made for a rather unsustainable kind of ecology. Next slide, please. And this ecology forced the government to enact drastic measures that severely penalized those who were marginalized by this situation. In 1952, because of the very severe flood situation that constantly hit Manila year after year, there would be a flood control plan drafted and implemented, starting with Elpidio Quirino's plan. But unfortunately, it led to the eviction of all estero squatters, strict enforcement of the laws prohibiting and penalizing the throwing of debris into estero channels, and blocking the flow of these waterways. In effect, being an estero dweller became punishable by law. It was deemed illegal and deemed criminal. So being poor, being a barong-barong settler was effectively criminalized. Next. And that's the unfortunate thing, because they were the ones marginalized by the structures of power. But every time floods hit, they were the ones always badly hit by floods, by tragedies. And we see that constantly in newspapers, etc. Next slide, please. And by the time of the Marcoses, they would also be subjected to these unjust situations, with Imelda and Ferdinand Marcos also creating a flood control plan, which more or less replicated what Elpidio Quirino did. So next. So here's Imelda inspecting the plans, looking at the esteros and how they would be helped. They would help in maintaining a flood control plan, but of course it didn't really materialize, and esteros remained a liability rather than asset. Next. And so to wrap up this discussion, I would like to pose a kind of point of reflection for us. I think it's mentioned in the exhibit here how residents themselves, the residents dwelling near the Esteros, how can they be active, how they can be active agents in transforming their ecology, not just the ecology of the Esteros, but the ecology of the entirety of Manila. Is there still a way for us to kind of recover this lost ecology of the Esteros? Maybe. Okay, maybe we can discuss that during the question and answer portion of our roundtable. And so I'll conclude with that. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you learned some insights from this presentation. Thank you very much.
Let's do it. Hello. Okay. So from the Esteros in Manila, we'll go to the Straits of Malacca. That's what I'll be talking about. The Straits of Malacca. Before I begin, I want to thank Dr. Flores for the invitation, the honorable guests we have here, the Philippine government, Sir Arvin, and everybody else who made this possible. And it's my first visit to Venice. And I've got, I think, so many photographs of drying laundry, of doors, and of seaweed. These are the three things I've been documenting. Drying laundry, hanging seaweed, and doors, some beautiful doors. So I'm going to tell you a bit of a story, two stories, about ecology. And it really, I think the two stories I'm sharing are a response, a kind of critique/response to the exhibit. There's a line in the introduction of the exhibit which says, "The estuary remains silent." And I'm going to suggest that's not so. The estuary remains. It's full of life, multi-species life, biology, ecology, microbes, animals, and plants. And I'm going to share a bit about those, but not in the case of the Philippines, but in the Straits of Malacca. So I'll begin. Estuaries amaze in the most brackish and uncharismatic ways. In doing so, they're nothing like coral reefs, black sand beaches, Boracay, or the blues of the ocean deep. Next slide, please. These are the sites of the stories that I'll be sharing. This is the Straits of Malacca here. Okay, next slide, please. So my plan today is to share two stories that illustrate the culture and ecology of estuaries in the Malacca Straits, seen here. But it's also my hope that you'll be able to hear echoes and resonances that speak to the guts and ghosts of Southeast Asia estuaries from Lawag to Cotabato. I live in Singapore, seen in the background there, where my home faces the Straits of Malacca. It's an historic body of water. Some have even called it the world's longest estuary, measuring about 1,120 kilometers. Lengthy and muddy, it teems with cultural and ecological life. Fishes and fishways, for example, abound in this narrow estuarine zone, and it's the abundance that has shaped the lives of Malay sultanates and port cities on both sides of the Straits of Malacca. Next slide, please. It was the richness of estuaries and of estuarine life that captured the eye of William Farquhar when he was serving as resident of Malacca from 1795 to 1818. That's him on the far left. A hungry naturalist, just like his contemporary Stamford Raffles, the so-called founder of Singapore, Farquhar commissioned two Straits Chinese artists to document the biodiversity of the port city's lands and waters. They illustrated the flora and fauna that people caught, encountered, feared, revered, traded, consumed, and kept as pets. Dated between 1803 and 1818, these two unnamed Chinese Straits artists produced 477 natural history drawings, while a team of unnamed Malay scribes penned and inked in Jawi and Romanized scripts the local names of the plants and animals drawn. Collectively, the 477 natural history drawings came to be known as the Farquhar collection. And so this is one of the drawings, and it's of a kingfisher, which is also an estuarine bird. From Malacca, the Farquhar collection traveled to Singapore before arriving in London at the Royal Asiatic Society in 1827. In 1993, Singaporean Goh Gyok Kim purchased the 477 natural history drawings at an auction, thereby setting in motion this collection's return voyage home. In 1996, Mr. Goh donated the 477 natural history drawings to the National Museum of Singapore. Today, they form a part of the museum's permanent collection. The stories that I'll be sharing today are inspired by two drawings from this remarkable collection. The first story comes from Singapore, and it's my hope that it will help us better understand what estuaries are, how they work, and who inhabits them. Next slide, please. This is the collection at the museum. Next slide, please. So this story, estuaries and buayas in the city-state. Estuaries are bodies of water. They're shallow and subtle, turbid and tidal. Yeah, and need maybe a little. Excuse me. They are unique because their waters are the result of rivers mixing with seas, fresh mingling with salt. Following Eng Seng Ho, a Malaysian scholar, we might think of estuaries as Creole waters, waters born from histories of ebb and flow, exchange, and influence. The conditions of estuaries co-produce cultures of resilience and reliance, worlds of organisms that thrive, but also delicately depend on others and other factors for their very existence and sometimes abundance. Next slide, please. To illustrate this culture of resilience and reliance, we can think of the estuarine crocodile, the world's largest living reptile, seen here. Next slide, please. This is the biogeographical range of the estuarine crocodile. It's found not just in Singapore, not just in Borneo or Malaysia or Indonesia, but also the Philippines. And in one of Rizal's books, he refers to this crocodile, but he calls it a caiman. But it's the estuarine crocodile. To illustrate this culture, so here's the map and for the crocodile's range. Distributed across the Indo-Pacific, estuarine crocodiles are heavy. They weigh up to about 1,000 kilograms, and they're lengthy. They're more than 6 meters in length. They are apex predators in and out of Creole waters. Next slide, please. In Singapore, estuarine crocodiles go by the Malay name buaya, much like they do in the Philippines. And they dwell in brackish places such as Sungai Buloh in the northwest corner of the island. Scientifically, the buayas are known as Crocodilus porus, and the name comes from the scientist Johann Schneider's description of a specimen in 1801. Next slide, please. And that's his description. Next slide, please. Nearly pushed to extinction because they were feared, misunderstood, and prized for their skins and skeletons, buayas have slowly rebounded since the early 2000s among Singapore's northwestern estuaries. The resilience of barking buayas, and they bark, and they're widely known for their linguistic diversity, is shaped by a culture of reliance on others that inhabit the world of the estuary in prolific and patchy ways, like tilapias, groupers, siakaps, or barramundis, or apahap in Tagalog, otters, crabs, birds, and macaques. These companion species, we might call them, figure not only the diets of buayas, but also their behaviors. Buayas hunt and feed at night while spending their days conserving energy along the water's edge. Indeed, the abundance of companion species, other things inhabiting the estuary, make possible a culture of crocodiles in urban yet wild Singapore. And in turn, the resilience of the city-state's buayas speaks to the healthiness of Sungai Buloh's estuarine ecosystem. Next slide, please. This is the buaya that was drawn by the Straits Chinese artist that forms part of the Farquhar collection.
While populating today's Sungay Bulow, buhayas have also inhabited the cultural and environmental history of the Malacca Straits. In doing so, they have played a role in smuggling the estuary into cultural and popular view. Excuse me. From the early 19th century, we have the brilliant Farquhar collection, which was again commissioned by Farquhar, but made through the collaboration of Straits artists and Jawi scribes who were based in Malacca town. It's their knowledge and expertise, not Farquhar's, that remains central to and responsible for the Creole production of this collection's environmental art. Now part of the National Museum of Singapore, this collection captures in detail and color, as you can see, the multi-species worlds that once called the estuaries of Malacca their home, including buhayas. Keeping the buhaya in mind, it's important to highlight how seasonal monsoons are central to feeding the culture and ecology of estuaries in Singapore, the Malacca Straits, and across the region. They do so in ways that shape the contours and salinity of local Creole waters and their muddy, nutrient-rich bottoms. Next slide, please. When dryness hits, for instance, waterways go parch, mudflats crack, plants wilt, and organic matter builds in the beds of long, winding rivers. But monsoons work both ways. They bring periods of dryness, seen here, and wetness. Next slide, please. Seen here. When the seasonal rains come, they flush layers of organic matter downriver. From Malacca's crabs to Singapore's buhayas, this nutrient-rich matter is vital to the production and reproduction of estuarine ecosystems. It provides and provisions the basic units of the muara, or estuary, thereby nourishing that dynamic Creole world where river swirls with sea, fresh entangles with salt, and water becomes brackish. Seasonal monsoons make possible unique kinds of chemistries that nurture unique kinds of cultures and ecologies. Next slide, please. It's this uniqueness or Creoleness that explains why estuaries are considered to be one of the most productive ecosystems in the world. As productive ecosystems, estuaries are central to feeding food webs that support the lives and life cycles of humans, non-humans, and the intercultural relationships between the two. For a sense of these relationships, I'm going to now turn to my second story, and this story comes from Sumatra. Through this story, my hope is to share a bit about the ways in which humans, through books, and spirits intersected in the estuary. So this is Sungai Bulow, and it's a thriving estuary. Next slide, please. So the story now is about Trubok, which is a fish, and it's going to be covering these little dots here, which are estuaries, the Siak, the Rokan, and the Remput. Like buhayas, next slide, please. Like buhayas, I'd like to start this drawing now from the Farquhar collection as well. Here are some of the fish drawings in the collection. These are trans-aquatic fish, spending their life cycles across sea, estuary, and river in the Malacca Straits. They are food fishes too, showing up in the markets from which our two unnamed Straits Chinese artists secured specimens to document them in color and detail. This is the siakap in Malay, but it's the apahap in Tagalog. So that's the barramundi, an estuarine fish. But the fish I want to talk about is captured in this drawing. Next slide, please. This one here. It's called Trubok. Trubok. It's a shad. It's similar to kabasi, which is a gizzard shad in the Philippines. Truboks are unique, just like the Creole waters they inhabit. They are not found anywhere else in the world, but here in Sumatra's southeastern estuaries. They are endemic. They also have somewhat a curious life cycle. Truboks are hermaphrodites, which means they change from male to female. This sexual transformation often occurs when the pias, or male fish, is less than a year old and after it has spawned. By year 2, nearly all fish are trubok, or females. During times of spawning, both males and females gather in mass in the estuaries of Sumatra's Siak, Bengkalis, and Rokan rivers. This spawning behavior is linked to changes in and outside Creole waters, from shifts in salinity levels and tidal depths to lunar cycles. Next slide, please. For trubok, next slide, please. For truboks, where and when they spawn is where and when they are fished. This makes for a special kind of industry because it's not the trubok's flesh that's prized or valued or traded, but rather it's the lure, the roe. Right here is where the eggs are, and that's what's prized. That's what people fish this, they capture this fish for. The roe of trubok could contain up to 200,000 eggs, and it was the fish's roe, or the lure, that shaped the culture and economy of Sumatra's southeastern estuaries. The lure of trubok was a prize staple on both sides of the Straits of Malacca. Next slide, please. This was especially true for the Siak Sultanate, and this is the Sultan of Siak seen here. The Siak Sultanate, which had under its jurisdiction the Siak Estuary, a vital and well-known spawning ground for trubok. We get a glimpse of the economic and political relationships associated with trubok from the compendium of John Henry Moore. Next slide, please. Moore was an Irishman born in Macau who moved to Malacca and edited the Malacca Observer before moving to Singapore to serve first as editor of the Singapore Chronicle and then as the editor of the Singapore Free Press, and finally as headmaster of Singapore Free School, which later became the Raffles Institution. His compendium, seen here, was published in 1837, making it one of the earliest English language publications printed in Singapore. But it's really less about Moore and more about the rich details that are found in his compendium that I want to bring into focus. Next slide, please. This is Bukit Batu. About the roe of trubok, Moore reports in his compendium, at Bukit Batu, this place seen in the picture, at Bukit Batu, a place on the main of Sumatra within the strait formed by the island of Bengkalis, exists an extensive fishery, well known in this part of the world. The fish which is the object of it is called in the Malay language trubok. The fish itself is sufficiently known in all the neighboring seas, but found with roe only here, which makes it certain that it repairs to this favored place for the purpose of spawning. The trubok is about 3 to 4 fathoms. It swims in 3 or 4 fathoms of water, and it's found near the mud bank. And about 300 boats are engaged at all seasons in the fishery. The roe are an article of trade, and the dried fish are sent to the interior. The Raja of Siak, the Sultan of Siak, draws a revenue from the fishery of 72,000 guilders, receiving a certain duty upon the quantity taken. From the rate and amount of this duty, it's ascertained that the quantity of fish caught yearly amount to about 15 million. 50 million fish were caught from this place right here. Next slide, please. And yet, Moore's compendium didn't know, and Moore didn't know, what he did know, was the workings of Sumatra's productive estuaries, and their trubok worlds were governed through a vernacular system of practices and practitioners. So Moore didn't know this. In this last part of the story, I'd like to think about this system, this vernacular system, and how it was called upon to ensure that spawning trubok arrived within the Siak and Rokan estuaries. Fishing for trubok and the harvesting of their roe was as much a matter of nets and seasons as it was about spirits and beliefs. From the Hokkien villages to the Malay kampungs, communities along Sumatra's southeastern estuaries were deeply anchored in the braiding of material and immaterial worlds. The braiding of these worlds informed the scales and fortunes of industrial production, whether estuarine workers were provisioning cities, sultanates, plantations, or estates with the necessary supplies of balachan, trasi, or turubok telur. At the heart of Sumatra's turubok-rich waters were Malay figures known as Jinjang Raja. Jinjang Raja. Jinjang Raja brokered between the seen and unseen natures of the Malacca Straits. In times of need, scarcity, or absence, they communicated to the spirits, recited the necessary incantations passed down genealogically, generationally, and enacted the required practices or made the expected offerings, essential members of Sumatra's estuarine worlds. From the late 19th century, we have a source that tells us a bit about who became a Jinjang Raja, how they worked, why they were important, and the language used to animate their intercultural relationships between humans, turuboks, and spirits. From this local source, we learn that Malay women always served as Jinjang Raja, and that these positions were passed down through genealogical lines. We learn, too, that they represented the head of their local turubok fishing unions. Culturally, the Jinjang Raja was called on to render their services in the turubok incantation. In one account from 1904, these services took place at Bukit Batu, with the Jinjang Raja in a richly decorated prao, or kind of a bangka, and surrounded by an audience of fishers and boats. What's more, she was dressed in royal attire and encircled by the wives of some of the notables in the area. Next slide, please. The reference to Bukit Batu and the turubok ceremony is significant because it echoes a scene in the Shahir Ikan Turubok, a Malay Jawi poem that was likely written in the late 19th century, but first lithographed in Singapore in 1902. And this is a copy of the book, the Shahir Ikan Turubok, and it's held at the National Library in Indonesia. More could certainly be said about this book, and I'm happy to talk about it, but I'm not going to go into it now. So why the turubok incantation in the first place? It's important to note that these incantations were observed and respected as special ceremonies rather than everyday events. As such, the reasons for needing a Jinjang Raja to perform her services had everything to do with the estuary. Next slide, please. The Jinjang Raja was enlisted if the estuary failed to swell with spawning turubok. She was called up to deliver her incantations if when the time of the catch came and the shoals of the turubok did not appear. In these cases, the Jinjang Raja performed a set of sayings to guide turubok home and to welcome them back to their spawning grounds. These incantations were also used to divine or decipher the reasons behind the turubok troubles, which meant, in practice, communicating with the deity of the turubok, Janji, who lived near the river mouth of Bengalis. So Janji, the spirit god of the turubok fish, lived in this area here. This is the estuary of the Bengalis River. As a key part of her practice, the Jinjang Raja was known to employ a language unintelligible to humans as she summoned and spoke not only to Janji, but also to the 16 local spirits who governed Sumatra's southeastern estuaries. From one source, we learn that it was convention for the Jinjang Raja to contact the spirits of Tanjung Padang, Tanjung Yati, and Blakan Batan and gift them siri, or betel nut, boxes, as well as other spirits of the surrounding estuarine zone. And while the Jinjang Raja used a language that no one understood, it was the role of the bidu, or a female assistant, to translate what the spirits replied, pointing to the corresponding siri box, the betel nut box, as she did to indicate which spirit was communicating with the Jinjang Raja. From caring for estuarine spirits to knowing turubok worlds, The expertise of the Jingan Raja was central to the workings of Sumatra's Creole waters and their massive production of fish eggs. In sharp and subtle ways, her knowledge and expertise were at the heart of maintaining the very cultural system that governed the lives and life cycles of humans and non-humans and the relationship between the two in the Straits of Malacca. Yet it's worth remembering as well that Sumatra's Jingan Raja were real women. Women with appearances, styles, mannerisms, families, and homes. In closing this story, I want to surface one woman, Embong Eda, who met with Jan Gramberg, a secretary in the residency of East Sumatra. At some point they met, Embo and Jan Gramberg. At some point they met just before 1877. And it's from Gramberg's ethnographic notes that we get a picture of Embong Eda, not only as a Jingan Raja, but also as a person. The current Trubok charmer, and this is from his notes, the current Trubok charmer is an old woman named Embong Eda, who resides in the Kampong Klapa Pati, surrounded by children and grandchildren. As her house is only half a mile from the capital of Bengkalis, one day I had her invited to pay me a visit. She soon complied and entered my house, accompanied by a procession of men, women, and children, all her relatives neatly dressed. Only she wore a sober dark dress and was not adorned with any jewels. In a courteous manner, she greeted me as Tuan Secretary, sort of this Sir Secretary, and I offered her some coconut and banana, and soon the acquaintance was made. Embong Eda is a woman of over 60 years of age. Her hair has already turned gray, but her face still bears the traces of its former beauty. Her eyes, when she sits calmly, seem as if they are with a soft haze, but when she gets into a cheerful mood, that misty expression suddenly changes. Those eyes then glitter with a strange fire, something that immediately suggests excitement. Incidentally, there is nothing special or strange about Embong Eda. She's talkative and lacks all the shyness which otherwise characterizes the women of this region. Being asked if she would have the kindness to share something about the Trubok ceremony, she immediately replied, quote, I will gladly tell you all that pertains to that ceremony, but allow me to tell you that I do not know what I myself speak or sing when I sit on the dongna, which is the boat in which she does her ceremony. This was made with such a calm simplicity and apparent sincerity that there was no deceit to be thought of here. After a short pause, Embong Eda began her description of the Trubok ceremony, of which she is the queen, and her story is here reproduced almost verbatim. I'm going to wrap up now. So, the quick end of the story is that the Trubok, which flourished for centuries and fed people and fed sultanates, and was fed by the organic matter that flowed down the river and that necessitated the Jingan Raja, the Trubok today, this endemic fish only found in Sumatra's waters, is nearly extinct. And it's nearly extinct not because of overfishing, not because of some industry. It's over-extinct because of pollution. In the 70s, along these estuaries, there were pulp mills, wood processing mills that were set up, and the sawdust has started to choke the fish that come to the estuary. So with the extinction or the near extinction of this Trubok, we also lose the cultural knowledge about the Trubok. So species loss is cultural loss. By way of conclusion, I'd like to close my talk by saying that each of these stories, the first about the buaya and the second about the Trubok, shed light on the culture and ecology of estuaries and their enduring relevance to Southeast Asia today. Like buayas and Truboks, many of the region's megacities, Manila included, are creatures of the estuary, hatched from the Creole waters that seeded their urban origins and powered their post-war booms. Singapore, Manila, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, and Ho Chi Minh City are megacities that evolved out of Southeast Asia's estuaries and whose metabolisms and excesses And I think we see the excesses in the exhibit here. The excesses, these excesses and metabolisms, they threaten the guts and infrastructures that made these ibu kotas, that's what they say in Indonesia, ibu kota, which is a mother city, possible. But just as poison and precarity permeate in and out of Creole waters, so too do culture and ecology, shaping as always the human, non-human, and spirit worlds that call these estuaries home. So never silent, I would say, the estuary remains. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's give time. We will make this quick because I think we're freezing to death. Being hopelessly tropical people, I think we will. Yeah. I have just two questions for Mike and Anthony. By the way, thank you for those wonderful presentations. Before we open the floor to questions from the public, I have questions on method and also on engagement. First, I think the public is curious how scholars study the estuary. So I'm interested in methodology, like how as historians, no, who are working on a material that is very interdisciplinary, how do you approach the estuary as material for scholarship, for research, and also for intellectual reflection? And because they have implications on a wider scale, how do you intervene in public debates around the life of the estuary? So yeah, maybe Mike, yeah,
I'll answer first. First, I think we have to establish that studying Esteros, at least within the discipline of history, is not yet that common. And so the question of methodology is something that's not yet answered, given that only a few historians. I mentioned Maria Luisa Camade in my presentation earlier, but even she doesn't really study the estuary as a central focus in her work. It's more of like a piece of evidence that she uses in order to build upon and use as an appendage to her main point. But historians that do focus on estuaries, actually right now I can't really name a particular historian who's focused on it. So and you're correct, it's really interdisciplinary, mainly because one has to work outside of his or her comfort zones. It's not enough for a historian wanting to go into estuaries and looking at its past cannot help but go to other disciplines, the natural sciences, for instance. It's tough to just simply look at the archive, because that's the typical methodology of a historian: going to the archive, searching for materials, and then documenting it. That won't work if we are dealing with estuaries, given that even in the archive, materials are very scarce. Mainly if you want to work on the history of the seas, the rivers, it's okay. There are a lot of references. But as for estuaries, because they are marginalized also within the natural world, it's tough to find archival materials on them. So a historian wanting to do research on this has to be interdisciplinary.
Thank you, Mike. Anthony?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I see the estuary as an archive, and it's got layers and layers of information, and each layer requires, I think, a different set of skills, a different method to access that. And I think key to the estuary is actually language. Just in my stories, there is like 4 languages that I was working with to kind of unpack that. There's Dutch material, there's Malay material, there's English, there's Indonesian, there's Spanish, and it's it's I think language is a key factor. So if for anybody thinking wanting to do research on the estuary, it's interdisciplinary, but it's also multilingual. It's interlingual. I think you need to have that to access. I think most importantly, if the method is trying to do something, it's really key to access the voices of people that are there. To get access to the spirits, you have to go through that Malay language material. I think the other thing about the interdisciplinarity is that the estuary I think it's important to remember that it's not just the social alone, but that there's a really rich ecological element to it. And so for those, again, wanting to think about the estuary, you can identify species and follow species as a method. So fish as method, following the turubok across cultures, across periods of time, across economies. That's I think, another important strategy or way of doing it. And then finally, estuaries have long been economic centers. There's a mud crab industry in the Philippines that's huge that comes out of the estuary. There's the milkfish, the bangus. The fry of the bangus come from the estuary, and then they're sent to the fish ponds. So estuaries have been very important economically, but I think attending or shifting our sight not just to the economic, but for me personally, it's about the multi-species and the ecological. And when I say multi-species, I'm also including spirits and beliefs. I think it's hugely important because most people who live around estuaries are very much in tune with the spirit world because it offsets that precarity, but it also engenders fortune. So
That's very interesting, Anthony. But I was thinking, given the richness of the material, why is there neglect in the field of scholarship on the estuary? Why is it because of the difficulty of studying it, or maybe the scarcity of material, or what do you think is the reason for the neglect?
Yeah, so my personal view would be, I think one more method for it is art. Art is really important. We can use art to unpack this kind of, I think, an estuarine story. But my personal view about why the estuary is overlooked in the scholarship, and this is coming as someone who works in the environmental studies field, is that I think, and this is reflected, I'll say too, I've gone to just about every pavilion here. I think scholars are just overly anthropocentric. They don't think about other species. That's our crisis, but that's also our blind spot. And I've gone to all of the exhibits except the U.S. one. I couldn't find it, or maybe I didn't want to find it. But I went to all except the U.S. And, I was overwhelmed with the focus on the environment, quote unquote, but in very generalized, abstract terms, but not really thinking about the plants and the animals, the microbes. And so I feel like that scholars are even, as much as we might some talk about the environment. This is a wonderful exhibit, but that estuary is full of life still. And that life does not come through in this exhibit. It's very much about people, which is perfectly fine. But I feel like that's why it's overlooked, because scholars are still, even when they don't want to be anthropocentric, they're still anthropocentric. Yeah.
It's a great response. Mike, you'd like to speak to that?
I want to answer that question by drawing an analogy with conventional history and non-traditional history. Because in conventional history, we always associate the past with powerful people. Kings, presidents, empire building, colonialism, and many of those quote-unquote important historical events happened with important bodies of water and land as the so-called stage for the enactment of colonialism, of empire building, of diplomacy. So seas are important because they are the platforms for conquests. Rivers are important because they facilitate trade between two different cities, two different countries. In contrast, the Esteros are part of the everyday. And in conventional history, historians don't normally focus on the everyday. How many historians are there trying to look at what did people really eat? What did ordinary people talk about in their inside of their homes? Most of the time, the focus is on so-called great people, with to the detriment of us trying to look at the minute parts that make up that compose everyday life. And I think that's one of the reasons why the estuary, as part of the everyday, it has been marginalized in favor of the more important bodies of water and land.
And I guess the research should be, well, it is already interdisciplinary. I think it should also be collaborative, no? So that it involves different people from different disciplines, that no one person can do it, no? I mean, that you can collaborate with scientists, with historians, with them. Yeah. And my second point before we go to the open forum is on engagement. On engagement, knowing what we know now about the history and the ecology of the estuary, I was thinking of some kind of a civic technology, like a way through which to harness the ecological potential of the estuary. What can you propose that, let us say, because there are so many social actors around the estuary, what do you, as scholars, what do you think, what can you propose to, for a civil society or a public sphere to do in relation to the condition of the estuary today? Yeah.
I guess civic engagement goes hand in hand with the interdisciplinary methodology that we have been talking about. And earlier I said that if one wants to look at the history of the Esteros, that historian cannot confine himself or herself to the archive, mainly because there's a lack of attention given to the Esteros. So you can't be so narrowly focused on getting documentation from the usual museums and libraries. You have to go out of your comfort zone, and historians who are used to archive, used to the archive, needs to go out and conduct oral interviews, focus group discussions, more of sociological in nature, and talking with the people. And so, and that's the reason why I said that it goes hand in hand with the civic engagement, because if you are really committed to an interdisciplinary methodology in which you foreground the experiences, the local knowledges of the people inhabiting these esteros, giving emphasis on their life experiences, what were the stories passed on from the generation of their grandfathers to their fathers, and then to them. By doing that interdisciplinary methodology, you'll be able to create another platform for civic engagement, because now you are telling these people that their stories are important. And that interrogates the whole notion I mentioned earlier, the flood plans from Quirino's time to the Marcos's time. The flood plans are okay on paper, but one major blind spot of these flood plans was that they failed to acknowledge that these people inhabiting the waterways also have their stories to tell. And we cannot simply marginalize them or even criminalize them. They have to be part of the planning process. So methodology and engagement, I think, goes hand in hand.
For me, I would say and I'm thinking now just the esteros in Manila in particular here. I think close collaboration between the universities, the National Museum of Natural History, and the communities to do nature walks and to appreciate the biodiversity that is in fact there. So much attention is on figuring out how to cross it, how to pull out all the plastic, how to do this, how to do that. But that estuary is alive with life. And I think if we can, through collaboration and engagement, cultivate a new generation who will appreciate the nature there, the biodiversity there, I think that will have dividends. That will pay dividends in terms of the longevity and the healthiness and the life of the estuaries. So not always looking at the estuary as polluted and dead, but in fact recognizing that it's alive. There's birds. I was in Manila, in Binondo in particular, not too long ago, and I walked around and there's plenty of birds. There's plenty of plants. I think cultivating a kind of critical environmental awareness that appreciates that biodiversity rather than sort of, rather than craps on it, Everybody wants to be crapping. And I think, I think I'd look at the other way. I'd see that there's promise and hope there, and there is life that thrives there. And I think that is something that could be harnessed. It could be nurtured, but it also sets the stage for future generations to really appreciate the biodiversity of that megacity, and to value that when the city is so large and it consumes so much and it's got this crazy metabolic energy, but things continue to thrive there, non-human things, and that's what I would hope through collaboration that's possible.
So maybe something away from the catastrophist mentality, Yeah.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah. And you also mentioned in our previous conversation, Anthony, about growing mangroves again in the estuary. Can you talk about that?
So estuaries are natural homes for mangroves, and it's important to know what species of mangroves. There's like about 2,000 different types, but they're natural homes for mangroves. And mangroves are nurseries for all kinds of aquatic life. So they're very vital in terms of the biological productivity of the estuary, but mangroves also provide against storm surge, and they help with erosion, and they've got all these kind of nature-based benefits. I think that would also be a fantastic thing. Mangroves also help filter bad water, much like the way oysters and other shellfish do. So I think, perhaps that collaboration is not just documenting and appreciating the nature of the city, but also engaging in rehabilitating the nature that was once there, the ghosts of nature that were once there, and bringing them back. So yeah, mangroves I think would be... Manila Bay used to be completely stranded with, or lined with mangroves, from Bataan all the way down to Cavite. But a lot of that has gone to the wayside because of various types of developments, and I think but it's never too late to bring that back. Singapore, as we both live in Singapore, has done an effort to bring that back. I think the key is knowing what particular species will thrive there.
Also, you mentioned to stop the reclamation. Is that also a proposition?
I think that's for everywhere. Reclamation is, I think it's a short road to nowhere, because it eats land that could be very viable for life, and we pave over it, and I think that's just not the right way to go. I think too many people also, when you do reclamation, the most marginalized end up living on the edge. They live in a state of precarity always. Climate change is affecting them seriously. So if we rehabilitate coastlines with mangroves, I think this is the way to go. It will bring back those nurseries, which then people can have livelihoods about, and so on and so forth.
So thank you. So I think with that, we can open the floor to a few questions before we have, reprieve from the cold, or maybe, one or two. But anyway,
That was Venice also like an estuary in Manila before? Did you undergo such where in one of the centuries that you had also problems like what Manila had experienced? Because if you say yes, then there might be hope for our estuary. That means that you are able to pass beyond that. But what I really appreciate about Mike's and Anthony's presentation, they were talking about the importance, the significance of the estuary from a historical, social, spiritual, economic, aesthetic, scientific. And now with Venice, they have, of course, architectural significance, which I think it could have been possible for Metro Manila had we really took care of our estuaries, as to what you mentioned, Mike. And I was talking also, like, the second point is the method. Like, maybe we just don't focus on Manila because we get frustrated we end up frustrated if we focus on Manila. Siguro I'll shift a bit and I'll speak in my own language. Kasi kung titingnan mo, yung estuary, hindi lang naman sa Manila yon. Buong Pilipinas may estuary. Sa Ilocano ang tawag doon Sabangan. Pag sinabi mong Sabang or Sabangan, it's the meeting point. Doon ka magkikita-kita. Kaya nga alive. Like in Surigao, there's an estuary that is alive. Surigao City, that's why they have the Asan, where you just pick up the fish from the banks. Or Rojas City has still a beautiful estuary. Or Dagupan is planning to have. Ang problema namin, yung sinasabi ni Mike kanina, pag kaming nasa scholars, pag kami ang nagsalita, mahaba. Hindi maintindihan. I'm pointing this to what NCC is doing as a representative. May bago tayong batas ngayon. We have a new law which is RA 11961, which is Cultural Mapping Law. In the Cultural Mapping Law, the attempt is to get the narratives from the ground. That is what Mike is saying, that there's that absence of a narrative. But ito challenge ko ito sa Pilipino dito sa Venice at sa alam nyo bakit? Sa aming karanasan sa cultural mapping, we have lost some of the stories because nandito na kayo sa abroad. Yung kwento. Kaya minsan, pag naghahanap kami ng kwento, sasabihin nila, you know that story about this estuary? Because we mapped the Pasay, no? That estuary is my aunt in the US. So the other is, that's my uncle in Europe. So can you get in touch with them? But the problem is, you are so important, the Filipinos here, because you bring your stories anywhere you go. And that's why you have to share this to your children, even if, they're losing already that kind of identity and more on the affinity to the Philippines. But what we are looking for would be these stories that really come from the ground, and hearing from Anthony, these stories are bordering on stories that are sometimes beyond science, mythical. Di ba meron din tayo historical, like fictional history that talks about it. But I'm not so worried. I'm more of a very positive person. You know why? Pag wala ang storya, pwede naman tayong mag-create ng stories. We can have our own narratives again. So I think the whole exhibit challenges us to have these stories, and the local people should say something about this. We reclaim it. So if we have those good plans for the other estuaries and even Venice that we would like to get as an example, I don't want to compare Venice and Manila. Sometimes that's the trap that we might fall into. Venice is distinct by itself. But if you talk about our estuaries in the Philippines and also in Southeast Asia, which is closest, I think we would be able to reclaim. So please tell your stories. Come back. Maybe not physically, but please bring your stories and tell us, because when you tell our stories, we will be able to complete. So yung Tripa de Gallina, isang kwento sa Pasay. Kaya pala siya Tripa de Gallina. According to those living in the Estero, Gallina is rooster. Because you're facing east, and because Tripa de Gallina is in Pasay, and east of that is Makati. So whenever they say this Tripa de Gallina, the rooster crows in the east. And so that's one story I got, which I didn't get from other sources, but these are local sources from a local resident from Pasay. Pasay, which is a child of Rizal. Before, so yun lang po, maraming salamat.
Not a question indeed.
Alia. Hi. That was absolutely interesting. And let me just tell you, Anthony, that mangroves are so neglected. I mean, I'm a big fan of mangroves, and most of the really successful stands are outside of Manila, in Palawan, and when you really take care of them, the place changes. No, I just have a couple of questions for both of you. For Anthony, we're talking about interdisciplinary. How do you? I'll see both questions. I have one for you also, Mike. For Anthony, so working together with other people, do you work with people, with scientists who work with the sea? And I'm just wondering what kind of collaboration you do because especially since we're an archipelago, the Philippines and most of Southeast Asia is an archipelago. So how does that affect your study of estuaries? Does what happens in the coral reefs or the siltation or the erosion, does it redound back to the estuary? And for Mike, I was going to ask you. I was just so the mythical and the spiritual side of the Malacca and all of that. Do we have stories like that? Do we have myths surrounding our own estuaries in Manila? I'm just curious. I didn't hear about them. Anyway, that's it.
Great. That's a great question about collaboration. And yeah, I do. I co-teach with scientists. I'm in a environmental studies program. I'm the only kind of historian in the group. Everybody else is a scientist. So I co-teach with an ecologist. I'm also at the Natural History Museum, where everybody there is a scientist or a biologist. And so I work really closely with scientists, not just in Singapore, but also in Indonesia and in the Philippines. So, and it's from them that I learn so much. And I guess I'm inspired by their science and their work. And then I try to find the cultural stories within what they do. So I usually use what they do as inspiration for my digging and my detective work. I'll go try to find, like the Jinjin Raja, the kind of the cultural belief systems that go into these very unique fish that populate this one particular area. So I work very closely with them, and it's through that collaboration, I think, that really shapes the way I see things and think about things and the kinds of questions that I ask. So it's definitely not done in isolation. It's certainly in conversation with friends and colleagues.
Stories, well, technically speaking, the Pasig River is an estuary. So in that case, there are a lot. We can take a look at Mutya ng Pasig and the stories passed down to us by Jose Rizal. And we can also include yung stories that were associated with Francisco Baltazar, Balagtas, since according, I think this is more of legend rather than historical fact, na the way that Balagtas was able to sort of discover his genius was because of those poems that he wrote for his loved one, and supposedly the canals of the Pandacan area served as the inspiration for that. Although yun nga, I can't really vouch for the veracity of that. But I think just to piggyback on Arvin's point earlier, we can still make our own stories about Esteros. Modern literature eventually, I think, will eventually become folklore in a sense. And we do have modern literature that look at the Esteros. Earlier, I mentioned Canal de la Reina, which was an artificial waterway created by the Spanish colonial regime. And Liwayway Arceo's Canal de la Reina, I think, is a good, not just story, but a metaphor of how that canal, which supposedly was meant to glorify the technological advancements of the Spaniards, eventually metamorphosed into an allegory of how deep in trouble we are because of pollution, because of informal settlements, and the moral corruption of the people inhabiting the waterways. So there are lots of stories about them.
Let me just say something very, very fast on the Philippine context. So two people come to mind. Two Ilocanos come to mind that I'm going to reference. So one is Jose Montilla. He was born in La Union. He was a scientist, and he studied the ipon fisheries. The ipon, which is the small gobies, the biang puti, the bia, this white the white goby that. So he studied that fish. It would go from sea to estuary to river, and he documented local ritual practices, praying to the various anitos. And these anitos that people would pray to and set up shrines for, they would do stacks, they would put cloth, they would use banana leaf, and they would make these little shrines for these anitos to ensure that the ipon would come and they would have a good catch. So that's Jose Montilla. That's in like the 1920s. And another one, Guillermo Blanco, also Ilocano, also from La Union. And Guillermo Blanco was a poet who then became a scientist. and also studied the Ipon and also documented the this kind of relationship between the seen and unseen worlds that govern the fishing of the Ipon. So, I think anthropologists, perhaps students, these things need to be, I think it's all there in many ways in documentation. It just needs to be, I think, researched and then go to the communities and see, almost certain, because in Bengalis, in this part of Sumatra, these folks are still active. I mean, they're still present. And I imagine the Loag River, the Cagayan River, these places all still have communities where there's this kind of belief system very much in practice. So, yeah.
You, Anthony, and maybe one last question from the floor.
Soundcheck. Hello. Good afternoon. When one of the speakers mentioned about engagement and collaboration earlier, and I really like, I really like the fact that when he said like engage people, walks, activities, and I think my question actually dwells on that thought as well. Like before going to the question, I lived in Thailand before, and on Monday it's going to be their Loy Krathong celebration. It's where they do like these flowers and they offer it for their spirits and all that. It's really nice because when I remember Thailand, I remember Loy Krathong, and so my question really is, do we have ongoing activities or like events spearheaded by respective LGUs and maybe the National Commission for Culture and Arts for people to also like remember and after the rehabilitation, then what are these activities that we have? But we try to like, okay, when I think of estuaries, I think of these activities. Do we have that? And so, sorry I'm asking because I'm not from Manila and I didn't really like grow up there, so I don't know what's happening at the minute. Thank you. Just that.
Maybe that's for Arvin.
Well, fairly recent, under our subcommission on the arts, like 2 years ago, we have the Taga-Ilog. It's a series of concerts. Filipinos are closer in terms of narratives if you use the arts. Yeah, that's what I like about Biennale, using the arts to convey something. So in the Taga-Ilog, that's referring to the Pasig River, we have a series wherein we can educate people about this. So these were multi-LGU because Pasig would cover several local government units. In what we're doing now with cultural mapping is that each LGU is doing cultural mapping, and you cannot miss the estuaries. There's so many stories about it. I can tell you like so many stories, and you'll be amazed with it. Even stories about Encantos, Rojas City we were able to document 21 mythical creatures out of the estuary. So there's so much richness and diversity. Even other rituals as well. We don't even have to go pre-colonial also. Like for example, fluvial, the Peña Francia or in Bacoor. That's why they had a problem when the highway was created because they cannot face already the sea. But it's supposed to be a fluvial. So all of this you can document from our own Spanish heritage, from our own Christian heritage, even Bonggao, like in Tawi-Tawi. So the Medrano, they were talking also about the estuaries as places of myths. And so we do celebrate that. We have also like books about it. NCCA is publishing a couple, and we're teaming up with the Department of Education for localization and contextualization. That you teach the estuary is something that beyond the resource, it's your lifeblood. That actually made your ancestors, and that's why you're here in this present age.
Thank you. One more from...
One more, Tita Nieves. Tita Nieves, you have question? Okay, come here.
Sorry, magandang hapon. Hello, it's functioning? Okay. No, I've only wanna magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. Good afternoon. I have only a simple questions about in the Philippines, especially this the topics of our in Biennale here about Esteros and about this flood, especially in Manila. I think is there any problem about this one, about the budgets, or I don't know, the drainage? I don't know. There are many famous architects or engineers. So I don't know. May I know what's the reason why? Because when I was still young, this is already a problem.
Yeah.
Flood. Oh,
Earlier, I mentioned the flood control plan of Marcos that was initiated in 1972, and eventually by 1975, nag-start na yung implementation. The problem, however, is that it entailed 3 huge structures. Only one of those, only the first one was completed during the martial law regime, and then the second one was completed almost right after 1986, and then the third one is missing. So I guess there are a lot of people who are clamoring for the completion of the third. But given the circumstances, I think even with the completion of the third, the ecology of Manila has greatly changed since the time of the Marcos. So even if we complete that third structure, I don't think it will be enough. So I guess for us to really combat floods, parang ano na rin like what you mentioned, interdisciplinary na rin yung approach. It cannot be very capital centric, meaning yung capital intensive, infrastructure driven kind of approach to floods, but more of holistic in terms of putting people first. Ba? Kasi if you think about it, why are floods a problem? Floods are a problem because mainly there's congestion in the cities. If there's enough space for people to live in, and we're not always congregating towards specific spots of the metropolis that are also flood prone, then flooding wouldn't be per se a problem. So if congestion is a problem, how do we decongest Manila? I guess it also involves creating opportunities, job opportunities in other provinces so that people wouldn't be flocking to Manila. So I think moving forward, certainly there can be short-term projects that can be implemented, like spillways, and improving the drainage systems, declogging the Esteros. These are short-term solutions, but they wouldn't sufficiently resolve the problem if we don't look at it from a holistic point of view, and that entails putting people first. Okay? What are their needs, and how can we give the Filipino people a more meaningful existence in Metro Manila? There's a solution, but it's that making a holistic solution will certainly entail a lot of time, effort, collaboration. There can be a solution. May short term tsaka long term. I guess I think that would be a simple answer to the question. There are short term solutions, but we also need long term solutions.
Yeah. So thank you for this, and yeah.
Thank you. We need another round of discussion, so stay put. Thank you, Patrick, Anthony, and Mike, for that very extensive, I must say, critical, and valuable discussion. Medyo may pagka-nostalgic din, yung discussion natin. Yeah, we can certainly not find one solution, but I think it is important that we are part, not only of narrative, but solutions, Sir Arvin. So thank you, guys. Hindi pa po tayo tapos. Thank you. Last May 18, we have opened the exhibition Tripa de Gallina, this exhibition, Gods of Estuary, co-curated by Architecture Y Funk and Sam Domingo. Sam Domingo, please. Hi. Yan po ang ating curator, one of the curators. It features the works of the Architecture Collective composed of architect Lyle de la Madrid, Bien Alvarez, Matthew Gan, Noel Sert Narciso, and social development worker Arnold A. Ranyada. Napaka-importante po ni Arnold dun sa project. Simula hanggang pagbabalik. So before we close the exhibition tomorrow, let us see once again a short video clip of its mounting. Mappy?
This project is an exhibit also.
So need natin yung same effect.
You of some memories. This exhibition and all other exhibitions that we have mounted since 2015 were made possible by the dedication and commitment of Senator Loren Legarda. Now I ask Patrick Flores to read her message. Thank you, Patrick.
I've been roped into, yeah. So this is the message of the good senator. So ladies and gentlemen, members of the Filipino community, friends and guests, good afternoon. We must acknowledge the pivotal role that bodies of water, particularly estuaries, play in maintaining ecological health. They mitigate carbon, purify water, and serve as natural defenses against coastal erosion and storm surges. By investing in their preservation and rehabilitation, we can reduce the adverse impacts of climate change and protect our communities. We can revive our struggling environment as our nation advances towards sustainability and inclusive growth. I am a strong advocate for this, and I can only underscore the need to reinforce social protection programs due to the climate crisis impact on health, livelihoods, and the economy and the well-being of all citizens, especially the marginalized. In the face of mounting environmental challenges and the real-world impact of climate change, the time for action is now. Through the extensive legislative initiatives I spearheaded and supported, we have effectively paved the way for a more sustainable future. The Ecological Solid Waste Management Act marked a pivotal step in responsible waste management, obliging communities to manage solid waste properly. The Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act reflect our commitment to combat pollution, protect our natural resources, and champion clean air and water accessibility for all. Our collective recognition of the adverse environmental impacts of fossil fuels led me to co-author the Renewable Energy Act, promoting sustainable and eco-friendly power sources. As part of our protective measures to shield the most vulnerable from climate disasters, I championed both the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act and the People Survival Fund Act, securing critical resources for local communities to adapt to climate change challenges. Fortifying our commitment to environmental preservation, we passed the expanded National Integrated Protected Area Systems Act, ensuring the protection and sustainable management of critical natural areas. Our efforts extend beyond individual laws. They represent a holistic commitment to building a more resilient and environmentally conscious and committed future. I would like to thank the Philippine Arts in Venice Biennale Coordinating Committee for organizing this gathering, prompting further discussion and exploration on this important subject. As we come together for the closing of Tripa de Gallina, Gods of Estuary, the official representation of the Philippines at the 18th International Architecture Exhibition of La Biennale de Venezia, rest assured that the work has just begun. Let us work together to protect these valuable ecosystems, empower communities, and address the environmental and those social challenges we face. It is only through our shared commitment and cooperative efforts that we can secure the enduring vitality of our waterways, thus ensuring a brighter future for our region and the generations to come. Thank you and mabuhay.
That's fast. Okay, at this point, I'd like to recognize the presence of Mr. Simone Venturini, Assessore Comune de Venezia. Good afternoon, sir. Okay. No. Okay. At this point, Mapi, can we share the... It's my honor to tell you that we are participating in the next Biennale Arte in 2024 with this exhibition. So the title is Sa Kabila ng Tabing Lamang sa Panahong Ito, Waiting Just Behind the Curtain of This Age, Curator Carlos Quijón Jr. and artist Mark Salvatus. May I also announce that our venue for next year will be a space in this area, but not this space. So, I don't know how far it is, but still in this space. So, yeah, we are participating for next year. So, clap our hands. Okay? So, that concludes our celebration. Thank you all. Thank you, everyone.